All right, welcome everyone. Thank you for being here today on another Discovering History. It's April 2026 already. If we haven't met, my name is Christy. I'm the Director of Museum Operations, formerly Director of Education and Engagement. We have another Discovering History this month, so most of the time they are on the first Friday of the month, but sometimes we will sprinkle in other speakers depending on their schedule, and sometimes on the theming of the month, so we'll try to put in a little bit more knowledge for you. So April 17th, we will have Rick Sheffield. He has a book called False Promises, and he'll be speaking on that. We'll also have copies available for purchase in the gift shop, and he'll do a little signing as well. It's the struggle for Black voting rights in the 1800s. So that one should be very interesting. And then once May comes, Friday, May 1st, we will have Mark Holbrook, and he'll be talking about photography during the Civil War. So that one I think will be very interesting as well. We also will be starting heavy programming for our schools in the area. May is a very busy month for campus marches, but we do still have a few days available. So if any of you are involved in schools, even within 2 hours, I get a lot of schools even from Columbus. Let them know if they haven't already signed up for a field trip. We do have some spots. We would love to have them here. They just need to reach out to me. And my information is available at the front desk. The cards, one that you might know. Alrighty, without further ado, today we are with Bob Mergel, and he is, after 30 years of teaching and coordinating civil engineering technology, Bob Mergel retired in 2012 from Columbus State Community College in Columbus, Ohio, and he was awarded the title of Professor Emeritus. In 2018, he retired as senior lecturer at the Ohio State University College of Engineering, Civil Engineering Department. He holds a Bachelor of Science degree in Civil Engineering from Ohio State University and a Master of Education degree from Ohio University and a Master of Science degree in Geodetic
Science and Surveying.
There we go, from Ohio State University. So he knows more than I do, clearly. So he'll be talking today about the Shenandoah, and then he'll also have his partner here talking a little bit about a piece that comes from the Shenandoah.
Yes.
Is that correct? Okay. So without further ado, take it away.
Okay. So I guess you can say I'm a Buckeye and a bobcat. So that puts me somewhere between a worthless nut and a nasty cat with an attitude. So anyhow, probably we're just south of a fairly historic accident over 101 years ago, the loss of the USS Shenandoah in Noble County. They had their 100-year anniversary last year, and it's been sort of interesting, almost a side note of aviation, about these wonderful large ships, and so got sort of interested in it. And so anyhow, and since this is the 250 anniversary or 250 anniversary / of US and also Ohio, we want to talk a little bit about America's role in the rigid airships, or the dirigibles. Of course, nice picture of me. Ohio is known as the birthplace of aviation because it's the home of Wilbur and Orville Wright, the first controllable aircraft. It was, heavier than air. Although lighter than air aircraft were pretty much developed overseas, primarily in Germany, after World War I, Ohio became almost ground central, or had quite a big influence on the development of lighter than air aircraft, or the large ships, the dirigibles. The dirigibles essentially are ones that have a frame, and the gas bags are inside, as opposed to a blimp where basically it's it's a non-rigid. So pretty much talk about the development of the rigid airships in Germany. First Battle of Britain, World War I. The Treaty of Versailles, reparations, and then, of course, our rigid airships. Observation to battlefield intelligence. To see anything that's going on, you want to get up on a high place. You need to get up, on a hill, or you climb up in a tower, or as the French in 1794 developed observation balloons. However, in the American Civil War, we had a situation where we actually developed military specification balloons, and we developed the ability to develop hydrogen to fill these. Hydrogen is much more efficient as a lifting agent than a hot air balloon. Not only that, but also these are tethered balloons, and they would have a telegraph line up to the balloon, to the observer. Some of them was one man, the larger ones 2 man, and for the first time you had real-time battlefield intelligence, actually almost going all the way back to the war room in Washington. Also, whenever there's a war going on, guess what? All the non-belligerents are going to send all of their observers there to find out what are the latest technological developments. So Oberleutnant Ferdinand von Zeppelin was sent as an official observer. And he obviously probably met Thaddeus Lowe and many of the other aeronauts. And wow, he became enamored with these things. So he finally was able to get a ride with John Steiner. And as he observed, I just now ascended to an altitude of 600 or 700 feet. And basically he saw the immediate idea of these can be used as reconnaissance. However, if you're a tethered situation, you're in one spot. How can I build something that we can move around in? Well, if you have to move around, you have to have propulsion. So by 1874, he's starting to be germinating in his mind. He says, well, we can make something. Well, back in Germany, they kind of called him the crazy Count. Ferdinand Adolf Heinrich August Graf von Zeppelin, or the crazy Count. So his idea was, okay, instead of having an individual balloon, what we'll do is we'll take the balloon, again, make it a gas cell. And we'll put it in a rigid structure. We'll build a frame around it. We'll put frames in between them. Then we'll put a protective covering so it's aerodynamic. And then, of course, we have to have a way to control it and propulsion, so gondolas for the operators or the aeronauts, and propulsion, and a way to steer it, and stabilizing planes so we can ascend and descend as part of it. So this was his idea. Time goes on. We're not getting all of it, but hey, it's the best we can do. It's a little bit off center, I'm losing. Anyhow, LZ1. So from 1863, it took him till July of 1900 to come up with the idea and build this thing. 420 feet long. This is 4 times the length of the Wright brothers' first flight. 400,000 cubic feet of hydrogen. Obviously a no smoking zone. Also, these things you had to take off into the wind and you had to land into the wind. Because as you would take this out of its hangar, if you got a wind on the side, it would blow it into the other side. So he built a floating dock so he could orient the thing into the wind. It wasn't too crazy. So LZ2 and LZ3 were experimental, and the government, Kaiser Wilhelm, says, hey, we might be able to use, there's a military use for these things. So Zeppelin built L2. The German was the L with just a 2. If it was built by the Zeppelin company, it was LZ, or Luftschiff Zeppelin. So there's a dual name on these. Unfortunately, the military, they had no experience with these things. They crashed the thing right away. Zeppelin at that time, he had become pretty disenamored with the military, but he realized he had to deal with it. So basically, he sort of turned everything over to another person. And from 1909 to 1914, they formed Delig. Now, this thing is about 5 blocks long, and I'm not going to try to pronounce it. But this is the same company that later on developed the Graf Zeppelin, the Hindenburg, and all the other post-war. So anyhow, and these were essentially designed as passenger ships, and they basically operated for a very long time without incident. Hugo Echner, who we'll talk about quite a bit later on, then became director of the military portion of it, and as he was an instructor, and he pretty much succeeded Ferdinand Zeppelin. When the Nazis came to power in 1933, he became a non-citizen because he was not, but he still had to realize the Zeppelin company had to maintain good relationships with the government to get government contracts to maintain business. World War I. So the Germans, Von Zeppelin, had taken the technology from the American Civil War, America's technology. After the Civil War, we just kind of went our own way and never developed much of anything. In fact, the balloon that was used in the Spanish-American War was a hot air balloon. And so they developed 115 of Zeppelin-type airships. They lost 53 of them and over 379 highly trained officers. The initial idea was these would be used for reconnaissance, okay, over the North Sea. In other words, and this basically hindered operations of the British. So here gives you an idea of, so here we have the Ostfriesland, German battleship, World War I, and you can see a Zeppelin in the background to give you the idea of the size of these. During the Battle of Jutland, no Zeppelin sighted the British fleet. However, after the battle, L-11 sighted the British fleet and realized that the Germans were sailing into a trap, and the German high seas fleet was able to escape destruction. Of course, the First Lord of Admiralty, Winston Churchill, saw these things as being dangerous. Up to this point, these were being used defensively. However, Churchill authorized a bombing raid on the sheds at Dusseldorf and essentially wound up destroying one of the ships and several buildings. Kaiser Wilhelm, obviously, he wasn't going to bomb his relatives in England. However, after the raid on the Zeppelin sheds, he finally authorized a raid, and LZ-24 and LZ-25 were given permission to raid buildings in London, England. A total of 9 people were killed and some buildings were damaged. Not a lot of damage, but to kind of give you an idea, by this time, these things are anywhere from almost 2 football fields long, 60 feet in diameter. Anywhere from 1 million to 2.1 million cubic feet. They could ultimately go to about 20,000 feet. They could go anywhere from 40 to 65 miles per hour. And they carried 19 to 21 aviators. And they were defensive. They had defensive armament. Now, could you imagine, I don't know about you, but I am deathly afraid of heights, to be on the top of one of these things at about 20,000 feet. I mean, that's a little scary. Just amazing, you know. Of course, immediately what happened is, even though the damage was very, very small, and there wasn't a lot of damage, morale dropped to radio. Hey, wait a minute. Our skies are open. People fear more raids or a German invasion. So personnel and material which could be used on the Western Front were pretty much kept at home because of these raids. Early on, basically, if you shot at one of these things, the bullet would just pass right on through. Okay, well, if some gas is leaking, we just throw out some ballast and we'll maintain buoyancy. And the aircraft at that time, which the VE-2C, it could only get up to 75 miles an hour. And if the Zeppelin, they come in, cut their engines, float in, and until the bombs drop, you don't know they're there. Then they hightail it out at about 40 to 65 miles an hour, and it takes this guy half an hour to climb 10,000 feet. Well, got a problem. So they tried all sorts of methods to down these things, and someone said, wait a minute. If we can ignite that hydrogen, they'll come down pretty quick. However, there's this little thing called the St. Petersburg Declaration that says we can't use exploding bullets against our enemy. Well, okay, exploding bullets. So in other words, if I shoot somebody, I'm allowed to kill him, but I'm not allowed to blow him up. That makes a lot of sense, but okay. However, the British says, well, we could kind of interpret it. We're not killing him directly. We just want to incinerate the ship, and they're going to come down. So they reinterpreted, and they came up with projectiles that could incinerate the hydrogen. Zeppelin's crew did not carry parachutes. Parachutes 20 to 30 pounds. Well, that's a couple bombs. So when the British were able to start to ignite these things, the crew, either you rode it down and fried, or you jumped out. And, you had the choice, and neither one was good. So now we have a war of technology. Okay, the interceptors can now get up to 10 to 12,000 feet. Well, we just build a little bit lighter aircraft, or heavier or lighter than air aircraft, and we'll go up to 20,000 feet. Now, the reason I'm going to mention this is later on we're going to revisit one of these ships. So, however, our ballast, we use water as ballast, it would freeze. Supplemental oxygen for the air crew, and the problem you had there is the oxygen that they put in those tanks wasn't the cleanest. It had kind of an oily, and it made the crews sort of nauseous. And if your cooling system on your engines wasn't really tight, water would boil off, or your engines would be starved for oxygen. Peter Strasser, of course, was the commander of the German Imperial Navy lighter than aircraft. So now this technology, okay, if you can go to 20,000 feet, we're going to go to 20,000 feet. There we had the French Newport, the Sopwith Pup, the SE-5, and of course the Sopwith Camel. But we, the British and the Americans, had something even better. The last proposed mission of the Germans was to bring the war to the United States. So LZ-112, along with two other sister ships, were going to try to cross the Atlantic Ocean and bomb New York. Unfortunately, Strasser and LZ-112 was lost in a raid over England. So the Germans did not have the honor of being the first transatlantic crossing in a lighter than air aircraft. British Zeppelins attacked. Essentially what happened was they won the British and the French war, won the war of technology, and 67 out of 115 or 66% of the Zeppelins were shot down or totally disabled. So you have somewhere between 20 to 30 people in one of these and a very expensive airship, and all of a sudden we can put 3 or 4 in one of these and have the same net material effect. So all of a sudden, as an offensive weapon, the airship sort of began to become a dinosaur. Under the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, basically Germans said, you are not supposed to build any more of these military war ships, and you're going to turn over everything that you have. So in other words, no more building Zeppelins. Of course, by this time, the United States Navy wanted to get their hands on a couple of these things. And we were supposed to get a couple of them, but the Germans, simultaneous with the scuttling of the high seas fleet at Scapa Flow when they surrendered this high seas fleet, they also destroyed all of their airships. This was our technology in the United States in 1917. DN-1, A-class blimp. It could hardly get off the ground. So obviously, we did not have the technology that the Germans had. Again, at least you can see they're smart enough to make a floating shed, so they could either orient the shed to take off and land into the wind. That looks pretty Rube Goldberg to me. In July of 1919, British dirigible R-34 finally touched down at Roosevelt Field. So this was the first transatlantic crossing of a rigid airship. And it was based on German design. But more interesting is we have a person that was a advisor, observer with the Royal Navy during World War I and was on the R-34. That is Lieutenant Commander Zachary Lansdowne. So with the success of the landing of the R-34, Zeppelin mania went wild in the United States Navy. We got to have these things. These are things, wow, these are really great. Lieutenant Commander Zachary Lansdowne. Here's the Ohio connection. Born in Grenville, Ohio. Graduated from the United States Military Academy. Commissioned. Assigned to Royal Naval Air Service, and after World War, he served as air crew on the British R-34 on the Atlantic crossing, and ultimately he was placed in command of the USS Shenandoah, ZR Zeppelin Rigid I, which is our first commissioned airship. So we relied very heavily on European technology. ZR-1 was based on a German design. Los Angeles was a German ship. LZ-126, which ultimately became ZR-3. The T-34 Roma, which is an Italian design. And, of course, the U.S. Navy R-38 ZR-2, which was, again, a British design. So, in other words, we didn't have the wherewithal to do it, but we were certainly going to go overseas and buy these things or use their technology. The first airship we bought from the Italians. This was an Army. I don't think I would want to step on that thing. I mean, that's really aesthetically does not look very pleasing. So the Army operated it from the 21st of November till February 19. So in other words, practically several months, and 410 feet, 83 feet diameter, 1.2 million. So this was not anywhere near the German design as far as capability and aerodynamics. During a test flight over Fort Monroe, the gas bag started leaking. The Roma pitched down. The box rudder came loose and was hanging, so control was totally lost, and ultimately became entangled in high tension lines, resulting in the thing going up in flames. 34 were killed, 8 were injured, 3 escaped. After the loss of that, and then later the R-38, basically the Army lost interest in large airships, and the United States vowed never to use hydrogen in lifting their airships, which will have other consequences. USS Shenandoah, Zeppelin Rigid ZR-1. It was based on a captured German Zeppelin, a height flyer, LZ-96. It crashed outside of Paris. The French, being the magnanimous people they are, said, "Hey, why don't you guys come over and take a look at this thing?" And they measured it down, everything down to the centimeter. So the USS Shenandoah was designed for altitude at the expense of some other qualities. And some of the newer features of newer Zeppelins were incorporated. She was lengthened about 30 feet to accommodate helium, because helium is not as efficient as hydrogen. So here's what L-49, 18 cells. And of course ZR-1, or 20 cells and 6 engines. So she was a little bit more lengthy, but had a very, in other words, wasn't just really a very, very aesthetically beautiful ship. She was built fairly strong. In fact, she was named the Iron Horse. Another Ohio connection. Star Truscott, born in Cleveland, Ohio, was one of the principal designers of U.S. Navy airships, the USS Shenandoah, USS Akron, and USS Macon. He was an aeronautical engineering, where back then was called the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, which was the predecessor of the NASA. So she was about 680 feet, so almost about 2.5 football fields, over 2.5 football fields. She was built here, 2.3 million cubic feet, service ceiling, the height flyer, crew of 25 aviators, and yes, she was armed defensively. So this kind of gives you an idea of the rigid structure in which the gas cells are made. Aluminum was a copper alloy called duraluminum, so they're relatively lightweight. The gas cells were fabricated in Akron by the Goodyear facility. They were made of what's called gold beater skin. It was the most impervious material. This time I'm going to ask my counterpart. In other words, I'm Tim the Tool Man, and here's Al Borland. And he can explain a little bit about gold beaters, and we have an artifact here.
Thanks, Bob. Appreciate the opportunity. I gained a lot of interest in this as a student in history because all of our families from Washington Noble County. In fact, my uncle ran the Lafayette Hotel for 30 years, and his nephew, which has a relative here, was one of your mayors for 8 years here in Marietta, Mike Mullen. But I really got really interested in the Shenandoah because our grandfather and great grandfather were oil diggers here in southeastern Ohio, but he had a farm over in Enoch Township, over just by Dexter City. And in 1925, when this ship came down, September the 3rd, he was one of those people who was out scavenger hunting illegally parts of the Shenandoah. In fact, I have an actual photograph. This is the stern of the ship. You know, it broke into 3 parts, and this landed at the crash site number 2, as is listed in Noble County. And so this is an actual photograph from September 3rd of all of those people who were out looting the parts and pieces of the Shenandoah. And it didn't take long till much later in life I found out that our grandfather actually scavenged one of the gas cells, and that Bob was talking about. And what's interesting is these are made really by the outer lining of the intestines of a cow or oxen. And it took 240,000 animals to create the 20 cells that was inside this LZ1, or the Shenandoah as we know it. The fascinating, this a very large piece of the cell of one of the 20 cells. And so, and the process it takes to make one of these cells is really amazing. But we have some other items up here, and I actually had commissioned this model made to scale as to what the Shenandoah looks like. It was the first helium-powered airship, and that was out there. And as Bob said, it's 680 feet long, so it's an amazing piece. But having said that,
Okay, thank you. Oops, going the wrong way. Yes, they can reverse the engines. Like the German World War II, World War I airships, the gondola or the control area was suspended below the ship itself, and you just had struts. And this would be one of the real Achilles heels of the early airships. She was christened on October 23, and basically, like we said, she was filled with helium rather than hydrogen. Helium has about 93% of lifting capability of hydrogen. It is non-flammable. It is an inert gas. Actually, because they can't get all the impurities out, so they figure about 88%. That's the good news. The bad news is there's only one place you could get, at that time, there's only one place you could get a supply of helium, and that was Texas. And of course, many of you may have heard about the teapot dome scandal and all that thing. And essentially, it cost $55 per 1,000 cubic feet, or a total of $115,500 to inflate it, or which would be equivalent to $1.8 million in 2019. Correspondingly, hydrogen was only $6.50. So it would have only taken about 1/8 of the amount of money to inflate her. So Now, the reason I'm mentioning this is later on we're going to talk about why some of these certain accidents and why things happen the way they did. And the helium, yes, you don't get incinerated, but it's very expensive. Early mishaps. Well, first of all, we took her out, and the first thing we did is we damaged the air fin. And again, these things were susceptible to wind damage. However, she did participate in a fleet action as a scouting fleet. She lost contact, and ultimately we did not have the support facilities out there in the sea to resupply her with helium, with fuel, with necessities. So, as a scouting ship, didn't work too good at first, but we were learning. October of 24, she successfully flew from Lakehurst to California. So it's the first cross country of a rigid airship. The Iron Horse's last flight. In 1925, a proposal was put forth for the Shenandoah to go up and fly over the North Pole, and that kind of got squashed real quick. Logistics was probably the biggest thing, and all of a sudden we got this big, beautiful, shiny airship, and the Navy really wants to show it off, so we're just going to send it out, and it's going to go through all the Midwest, Indiana, Illinois, and Ohio, and we're going to show this thing off at the various state fairs. By this time, Lieutenant Commander Zachary Lansdowne, he also raised concerns. He was from Greenville, Ohio. It seems like, I don't know about you, but it seems like about every September, one of the hurricanes comes across the Atlantic and then comes up the Ohio Valley and goes through Ohio. I don't know if you remember Ike. It wasn't so much the rain, it was just a lot of wind damage. And so Lansdowne was a little nervous, says, wait a minute. He says, this may not be a good idea because of the weather. However, he did not push the issue. Also, if you've ever seen the movie, I like to show some of the movies and things like that. USS Shenandoah is featured in the movie The Courtship of Billy Mitchell, where Gary Cooper plays Billy Mitchell, Zachary Lansdowne is Jack Lord is, and of course, Elizabeth Montgomery. And this is the scene where Lieutenant Commander Lansdowne explains his misgivings about the promotional tour of the Shenandoah during those unsettled weather conditions. On September 2nd of 1925, she departed Lakehurst. Weather looked good. As she crossed the Alleghenies on a westerly course for an overflight of the Ohio State Fairgrounds in Columbus, Ohio, the next day. Now, just imagine it's 1925, and you're at the Ohio State Fairgrounds, and all of a sudden, this thing comes over. You see a shadow. I'm in a shadow. What's going on? You look up, and this thing, 2.5 football fields long, floats over you almost silently. I mean, that would cover probably from 17th about a third of the way down to 11th. That shadow. That's how massive these things were. About 3 o'clock in the morning, weather conditions over Cambridge got very, very bad. They noticed clouds and thunderstorms and all kinds of things. And so by 3:15, Lansdowne was alerted. Okay, we're going to try to skirt around this thing. They were fighting headwinds, and about 5 a.m. near Ave, Ohio, basically the ship was caught in a violent updraft. It went up from 3,000 to 6,200 feet. Well, if you know anything about air pressure, the farther you go up, balloons expand. Well, the gas bags started to expand very quickly. The relief valves may have not been working efficiently because they closed off some of them because they don't want to be valving off this expensive helium. So there may have been some internal rupturing of the structure because of the gas banks. The crew valved off as much manually as much as they could. Just as they went over the top of the roller coaster, down she came, and they finally regained control at about 3,000 feet. About that time, the wind, there's torsion. Lansdowne says, ordered or did not order, but he suggested any of the air crew that were in the gondola, please go up into the envelope. So several of them went up in the envelope. That's where she was twisted in half. Commander Lansdowne and 8 crew members in the control gondola died in the crash when it detached because this was suspended below. This was the World War I design. 2 men died also because they fell through the hull, and also some mechanics died because they were with the engines. And of course they separated. Crash site 2, as you're coming down 77, you can see the flag, and you'll see off to the side, they have the monument there. The largest group were 18 men who made it out after the stern of the airship crashed and rolled down the hill. And where this, you can see, as you're coming down 77, you'll see a valley, and that's in the hill in the backside. That's where they have that, the marker. The third part, the nose detached, and it pretty much free floated for quite a long time, almost 12 miles, until Commander Charles E. Rosendahl, or Lieutenant Commander, well, he's dead. And here's another interesting thing, because Rosendahl was the commanding officer at Lakehurst when the Hindenburg arrived. So another interesting little tidbit of knowledge, and that's where the use of helium as a lifting agent at least saved 29 of the air crew, and they basically were able to ride the 3 sections down. Afterwards, Gary's relatives went out there and stripped her clean. It's his fault. They said that, people were just carrying stuff off. This is where the thing of it is, where the nose section came down, there's a road fairly close to that, and they stripped her clean. There was an inquiry, and yes, it did bring up about Lansdowne's concerns. But, you know, he was a lieutenant commander. However, Billy Mitchell, because he had already been demoted, moved to Texas. He was out of the Air Corps, and he seized on this to publicize incompetence and quite a few other things about the admirals and generals and the military in general about air power and their lack of competency. So, in my opinion, these incidents, air disasters, are the direct result of competency, criminal negligence, and almost treasonable administration of our national defense by the Navy and the War Department. Well, you know, that probably didn't go over too good. So anyhow, he was basically suspended for quite a period of time, and without pay for 5 years. Unfortunately, he was in 1919, the British airship R-39 was about partially complete, or R-38. R-39, R-34, R-40 were they didn't even start it. And with economy measures, they wanted to get rid of this thing, so they reached an agreement with the United States Navy, and we bought it for 300,000 pounds. So we were going to buy a British airship now, ZR-2. Again, notice it had a lot of characteristics of L-49. Again, the British and the French and the Americans were still using the German model. So the British really didn't have much during the war. However, later on, they began airship production. However, as work on the R-39 progressed, we sent over our metallurgists and our engineers, and they became alarmed about the fact that there was no factor of safety in the structural design. So the British were supposed to teach us how to operate this thing. And they recommended 100 hours of joint Royal Navy and U.S. Navy flight testing. Commander Maxfield said, "Hey, we can get this done in one day. I want to get out of here. Let's take this thing home." So the Air Ministry compromised. 50 hours would be sufficient. And of course, the U.S. Navy contingent was ready to go. Early on, when she made her maiden flight, they noticed that her horizontal stabilizer and vertical rudders were overcorrecting, and they also noticed that there's some structural issues. And when they said, "Oh well, let's go ahead and run her up to about 58 miles per hour," and she began to oscillate. Upon investigation, several of the girders at shift had failed. So they took it back and patched it up. The next one, they took it up to 62.7 miles at a very low altitude. And then they put it through control reversals. Germans would have never done this. And basically it broke in the middle. And it exploded. And it came down in the water. 16 of the 17 Americans died, 28 of the 32 Britons. Here's all the petty officers went down with her. ZR-3, Luftschiffbau Zeppelin LZ-126, or ZR-3. This is a Navy recruitment poster showing the USS Los Angeles. Navy was still, even though we've had several catastrophes. So the Zeppelin company was still building airships for commercial purposes. Because they sabotaged their World War I ships, the deal was worked out whereby the United States would be given a German Zeppelin. The most modern one they had, that would be designed and built for the United States in lieu of the reparations that we were entitled to. And under the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, it had to be built as a passenger ship. It could not be used in a military fashion. Big ship, 2.6 million cubic feet, 10 officers, 33 crew, and it was designed to operate on either hydrogen or helium gas. It arrived here on October 12th, 1924. Hugo Echner, the director of the Luftschiffbau Zeppelin company, came with it. All testing and transit was performed with hydrogen gas as a lifting agent. And it arrived after an 81-hour flight at Lakehurst, New Jersey. Immediately, the lifting gas, the hydrogen was valved off, and it was replaced with helium. We didn't have a whole lot of helium, so guess what? They just deflated the Shenandoah. Simultaneously, the airship was fitted with equipment to recover water from the exhaust. Okay, to go up, you let water out, or the ballast. To come down, you valve off gas. Valving off expensive gas at, what was it, $60 per 1,000 cubic feet. That got to be expensive. So, as you were burning off your consumables, such as your fuel for the engines, or releasing ballast to go up, what they did is they fitted this to get the water vapor from the exhaust to recondense it and to replenish ballast. Those Americans are pretty nifty, aren't they? She was commissioned by President Calvin Coolidge's wife on November of 1924. We had some operational problems. Problems is, as you can begin to see, if you have a pressure gradient, this thing wound up being almost lost at the mooring mast. They were able to bring her down without minimum damage. Okay. Also, the USS Los Angeles was started to use as a trapeze system for parasite aircraft. In other words, a floating aircraft carrier. She was supposed to be, under the terms of the Allies, they permitted the United States to use it as an experimental commercial. Because there's, hey, World War I is still pretty much in the back of everyone's minds. And we're in the 1920s and the 1930s and saying, wait a minute, we're not, that's a German airship and it's not supposed to be used for military purposes. But it did participate in 2 exercises and demonstrated little particular benefit to the fleet. Again, here is a Lexington class aircraft carrier with this thing on top of it. These things are monsters. So, after the experiences of the Shenandoah and lack of facilities, the U.S. then recommissioned the USS Patoka as a supply ship and a tender. So at least, and the mooring mast again is a combination U.S. and British design. The Germans were not using mooring masts early on. So again, we're taking technology. It's the longest serving rigid airship in the United States Navy and the only one that did not meet a disaster. Flew over 200,000 miles to Panama, Costa Rica, and she was decommissioned, recommissioned after the loss of the Akron, and then was fully struck from the rolls in 1939, and the material was then used for other aircraft. Okay. Here's our biggest involvement, the Goodyear Zeppelin. Have any of you ever been up around and seen the big air dock up at, did you go by? That thing is, wow, amazing. So, Akron, Ohio built the structure for lighter than aircraft, basically the air dock. It was created in 1923 as a joint venture between Luftschiffbau Zeppelin and the Goodyear Tire and Rubber Corporation. This is the Ohio connection. Okay. So once again, so anyhow, oops. So in 1924, Zeppelin's chief stress engineer, Carl Einstein, arrived along with 12 hand-picked Zeppelin engineers. remember, back then, development of airships in Germany was pretty well constrained. Plus, also, about this time, something else happened in Germany. There was this little, I don't know what you call, political group down in Munich. They're kind of getting a little uppity, you know, the beer hall push. Arnstein was a Jew. Many of these people were Jews. And it's conducive to long life and health to get the heck out of Dodge City if you saw something coming. So many of these people that came over stayed here. Also, you know something else? What did we do after World War? So we imported the expertise. What did we do after World War II? The rockets. Deja vu all over again. So anyhow, Arnstein was involved in the design. He became a U.S. citizen. He actually rose very high in the Zeppelin company. This also ultimately became Goodyear Aerospace. So for comparison, these were 685 feet. The Hindenburg was what? About 20 feet longer. About the same diameter. So in other words, just to kind of give you an idea, these were big airships. And they were designed specifically as aircraft carriers. We went a bit further. We realized that the German design had some issues, so we did a double structure, an inner and outer structure for strength. Also, we made the main keel on the top instead of the bottom, and the main reason for that is, let me get past this. We're using helium. It's not explosive. We can put the engines inside. We can then rotate the propulsion either up, down, reverse. And that way, could you imagine being a mechanic and have to crawl out a little gangway and into the gondola where the engines are, and then of course having to listen to all that. So we were able to put everything inside the ship. The outrigger propellers, basically, and bevel gears allowed the propeller to be rotated to provide thrust not only forward, but in reverse, vertically, up and down. These are amazing ships. While Germany and France and Britain still used gold beater skin, the cow's intestines, Goodyear developed a rubberized cotton, a little bit heavier, but much cheaper and much more durable. One of the problems they had with the Shenandoah was the gas bags would start to leak and then they'd have to repair. They had repaired her several times, and of course the outer skin. These were very high maintenance. And then later on, they came up with another compound, and this basically then was taken back again. Akron, Ohio. All the developments by Goodyear is then basically, as far as better gas bags, better design, that got shipped back to Lift Ship Bow, Germany, and now so some of these could be incorporated later, the Hindenburg. Okay, now there's a big deal about the Hindenburg, Eckner. They were going to come over. They're going to try to get helium from the United States to fly the Hindenburg. It was designed for helium. We didn't have hardly enough to inflate our own ships. So scarcity was problem number one. Number two is a strategic material. And by the late 1930s, the United States did not view Germany as what would be a very friendly country. I always thought these were windows. They're not. That was the gas recovery system. They developed the Sparrowhawk F-9C fighter, and these could be captured, brought into the ship. And so these are essentially floating aircraft carriers. It was designed specifically for that situation. So they would come up, clamp onto the trapeze, and then the crane would lift it up into the airship. So this kind of gives you an idea of the operation and the hangar layout. So you hangared 4 of them, and 1 of them was on the trapeze. So they had 5. These were basically, the initial intent was we could use these as for offensive fighter. Later on, the Navy rethought their idea, saying, wait a minute, no, this extends as a scouting exercise. So they essentially became scout planes. So the Navy was reworking their attitude. Akron made a cross-country flight from its base to a new airship in Sunnyvale, California. So again, we were going to have airships on the West Coast, airships on the East Coast. Another issue of operating these things, you had to have a horrendous amount of ground crew. When they came over, they would drop the lines, and then you would have to grab a hold of the lines and then basically put them on winches and winch the thing down. If all of a sudden there was a sudden wind or there was a pressure gradient, the airship would go back up. Now you're talking quite a few men trying to manhandle. These things are literally manhandled into position. Unfortunately, some people didn't let go, and they went up with the airship, and before they could get it under control, they died. Of course, one of the things is, hey, we got this beautiful thing. Let's have an overflight for the inauguration. So again, once again, how to get funding? Well, publicity. On 1933, April 3rd, basically they were on a mission to calibrate radio detection finding equipment. So they were going to put radio detectors on them so that they could get directional radio. So if there's something out there in the Atlantic, they could triangulate the position. Sort of the precursor of radar. Rear Admiral William Moffett, who was the chief of the Navy's Bureau of Aeronautics, was on board. This is the biggest proponent of lighter than air aircraft. After casting off late in the day, the Akron encountered fog and severe weather. Unbeknownst, they were flying ahead of one of the worst storms that swept the North Atlantic in 10 years. She was hit with a series of strong updrafts and downdrafts. She rose and fell, and attempting to climb, the ship's tail struck the water, and the stern dragged under. With the stern filling with water, essentially, she began to buckle, and as a result of that, too much strain on the structure, and she essentially went down. They were not carrying life preservers. The German merchant ship Phoebus saw lights descending, and they altered course, but they were only able to save 4 of the survivors. They could not reach them, and of course, without life rafts or life preservers, all of them pretty much succumbed. U.S. Coast Guard cutter Tucker, first American online. To add to the disaster, we also lost the Navy blimp J-3 during the rescue operation. And of course, other ships were dispatched to pick up the survivors, which basically became a recovery operation. So basically there are two theories. One, the stern was driven into the water by a downdraft. The other one was they weren't flying high enough. They flew into a low pressure area, which means their altimeters were not accurate. In a low pressure area, as you go up, the way your altimeter works is that, okay, based on air density. And if you're in a low pressure area, it says, oh, you're actually higher than what you were. So the other thing is they felt that the ship was flying too low. And that's how, and did not take into account the length of the ship when they tried to come out of the dive. "76 people went down with only 3 survivors. The other rescue survivors. And again, lack of life jackets and life-saving gear. Identical to the Akron was the Macon. Of course, the admiral's wife christened her. Now you notice that the Akron was flying for almost 2 years, and then they finally, about a 6-month overlap, they started with the Macon. Helium. That was the weak link. We just didn't have enough helium to keep all of them up in the air. Again, it participated in numerous exercises. By this time, the Navy is starting to really get nervous about these things. We've had quite a few disasters, not only here, overseas, extremely expensive, high cost to operate, and what little return. So, to try to prove that this thing could actually find something, President Roosevelt was on the USS Houston. He was on his way to Hawaii, went down through the Panama Canal. After the Panama Canal, they did not know where he was located. And the exercise was for the USS Macon to locate him. And they did. And they overflew him, and they dropped the daily newspaper to prove that they found him. So again, this was a publicity stunt to say, hey, and actually the lighter than air aircraft division actually saw fleets of these things. This was going to be, this is the way of the future. She was used in many fleet operations, and the good thing about it is with the Sparrowhawk, the search radius was much larger, because they also found out that these things are extremely vulnerable to attack from aircraft carriers. So it could stand off quite a bit and then do scouting. So essentially, we see where the Germans started out as observation, and then it became an offensive weapon. Now all of a sudden we've gone from an offensive weapon back to an observation and scouting weapon or system. Now, if you want to see a really goofy movie, you got to rent this one. This is Jimmy Cagney and Pat O'Brien at their best. But there are some really beautiful shots of the USS Macon, of some of the operation. Here comes the Navy. And of course, Jimmy Cagney's playing the bad boy, and Pat O'Brien's playing the chief petty officer that tries to keep him in line. But there's some really beautiful. In fact, actually, there's one scene where they kind of reenact where the Akron, where the crewman gets lifted up, except this time Jimmy Cagney saves the crewman. So, yes, it did make it in the movies. And here's some scenes from the movie. So, again, rough air. Notice a pattern. Rough air, damage. So essentially, they made repairs, and again, some of the design deficiencies that they found really weren't fully incorporated. So finally, a year later, after they rebuilt parts and some of the structural modifications, particularly in the tail section where it was a weak link, it ran into a storm off Point Sur. The airship was again in a wind shear, caused the structural failure of the upper unstrengthened ring and the tail fin. The fin failed to the side and was carried away. Pieces of her structure punctured the gas cells, caused gas leakage. They jettisoned ballast. Control was lost, tail heavy, the engine's running at full speed. She went up to about 4,800 feet, past her pressure limit, and once again, structural damage occurred as the gas bags expanded and began rupturing the structure. SOS call was put out, will abandon ship as soon as she settles into the water. It took about 20 minutes to descend and gently went down into the Monterey Bay. Only 2 crew members were lost because of the warm conditions and the life jackets and inflatable rafts. Plus also they had plenty of time. So 64 surviving crew members picked up. Again, 64 crew on one of these things. And as a result of that, they were picked up by the cruisers Richmond, Concord, and USS Cincinnati. On June 24th, 1939, the Yankee Clipper, Boeing 314, flew across the Atlantic with one of the first commercial crossings. So now we had a larger than air or heavier than air aircraft that could perform the same, had the same capabilities with much less crew and maintenance. So, in conclusion, this is a story of ambition, achievement, determination, also politics, mistakes, disasters, and the advance of technology. They were designed primarily to conduct long-range scouting and reconnaissance in support of fleet operations. They were uniquely qualified to do that. Now, in other words, they could go across the ocean. They could go out to the middle of the ocean. But this is before the advent of advanced long-range aircraft and advanced radar. Although they were relatively vulnerable to attack in severe weather conditions, or they were relatively vulnerable, and of course they were rendered obsolete by advances in technology. So essentially they became dinosaurs. That's it. So I'll kind of give you an idea. Any questions? Yes. They're blimps. They're literally basically the bag is the structure. So they don't, and essentially then the gondola is literally incorporated into that structure, but they don't have any rigid. In other words, essentially they're just an aerodynamic gas bag. They're really, really neat because, we were lucky. I worked at Bolton Field, up at Columbus State Bolton Field, and we were out doing a survey program and surveying. All of a sudden, this tether just drops between 2 of our crewmen, and you look up and holy shit, this thing's right there. Like, wow, where did that come from? And the Goodyear people were just absolutely wonderful. They couldn't take us up because of, but they allowed us sit in the gondola and they fully explained everything. They're amazing airships. They're just so.
I live out in Mineral Wells. It's been several years ago. I heard some noise, humming, or like propellers or something. And I thought, what in the world is that? And I walked out of the house and looked around, didn't see anything. walked around the back of the house, there was a Goodyear blimp
Yep.
about 100 foot above me, just going like that. I think it landed out at the golf course or something. They were having some kind of, I don't remember when it was, what year, but I think that's where it come from. And I looked up, it was like 100, maybe 200 feet right there behind my house.
The other big problems you had with these is getting in and out of the hangars. You had to have perfect wind conditions because as that ship came out, these are literally being manhandled out of those. And if you got a side wind, it would be pushing it into the shed. So I mean, they were just they were, you know, a lot of crew.
I thought I might mention, you may already know this, but the Ohio Legislature last year dedicated on 77 at mile marker 32 the Shenandoah Memorial Highway.
Yeah, you'll see there's a sign out there, USS. It's not too far from Crash Site 2. And you can see Crash Site 2 from the highway. There's an American flag and because you can get to Crash Site 1, you can get to Crash Site 3 fairly easily. And of course, in Ava, Ohio, you can get to the memorial. But Crash Site 2 is kind of remote.
That's on 78.
77. 70.
78 where the memorial is. I know I rode my motorcycle and stopped.
Yeah, Ava, Ohio.
Is that 78?
Now there, I can't remember what it is.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, me too.
And there's a couple that have a small trailer, and that's the. And sometimes, and you almost have to make a appointment with them, but they have quite a few artifacts and things. It's just that is the Shenandoah Museum. It's a mobile home.
You ready?
Yes, sir.
My father was one of those guys.
One of those scavengers.
That the engine run for quite a while after the plane broke up. So they were found early up over winter. And I think smashed on it. They were like 1,500 horsepower.
Well, they were massive engines to drive that thing.
What were they powered by?
Gasoline.